Hello, and welcome to chapter 4. We're going to be hitting perceiving self and presenting self. And as always, just as a reminder, if you can't see things well up here, you can go on Blackboard. I have the PowerPoint, and you can open this screen and the PowerPoint and another, and you can see them side by side. Um, so, one of the opening parts of the chapter talks about how everything we're building off from the last chapter in perception, it affects in terms of self how we communicate, how we behave, and certainly how we perceive the world around us, certainly including other people. Do you recognize Toy Story up top? So the reason why I have all those four selfies is the idea behind this chapter is we have so many different parts of ourselves. Now, our chapter talks about three of them in terms of self-concept, self-esteem, self-efficacy, and I'm adding in another important self on self-fulfilling prophecy, even though it's not in the textbook. So the very first part of the chapter goes into self-concept. And as you can see from up here, thinking about it in terms of what you see when you look in the mirror. Now, I've been told sometimes my clip art is pretty bad. I stand by it till you send me better. This is the idea of in a stable. So our self-concept is relatively stable. In just a couple slides, I'm going to ask you to define 10 different parts of yourself. You might think about in terms of roles or traits that you feel like you are. Typically, the ones that we think of when we look in the mirror, they don't change much over time. Again, it's relatively stable. When we think about it in terms of self-esteem, what we mean by that is thinking about those self-concept terms. Do we evaluate them negatively or positively? And you might find it's a mix. I know I have that for me too. Number 3 is self-efficacy. And that's the idea of we're able to handle a task. So for instance, for some of you, online might be very new. And when you come into the class, especially in the first week, you might have some idea of what you're getting yourself into. It might be more than you expected. It might be less. You might feel overwhelmed. And as you look at the module, and I have 10 parts of read the announcement, read through the syllabus, here's how you complete it. If you're checking off one by one, you might find your self-efficacy goes up. Just the idea of, yeah, I'm on it. Okay, I have all these things to get through by Sunday night. Through managing your time, you're going to find that you're very good and very capable. So all that goes into self-efficacy, the belief in yourself that you'll get it done. I don't know you yet, but I do want to tell you, I do have the belief that you'll get it done. The reason why is just by you watching the video right now, just by making sure that you're logging into Blackboard, you're getting acclimated of what you need to do. And of course, it's going to get easier over time. Oftentimes, the first week is hard. So be kind to yourselves as you go through all this. The last one is self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's the idea of what we believe is going to happen will often set the conditions up for it too. My clip art, if you think it, she's pretty pregnant, huh? And then you do it. Get, think, and do. So again, as you're looking at these things through the modules, you might think very positively of, okay, there's 10 things I need to do. I know I'm capable of it, but I'm working X hours. I'm also taking a sociology class, whatever it might be. But when you know that you're going to do it and you set the time aside, or when you're taking notes, all those things, you think it and then you do it. We set up the condition for these things to happen. So self-fulfilling prophecies can be positive or they can be negative. You might have friends who psych themselves out before they even start something. It could be imposed by self, so it might be the things that you say, your internal monologue going on in your head, or it could be imposed by others. So maybe you have fantastic parents who tell you all the great things about you. Um, Unfortunately, that's not always the way that it works, and sometimes we hear negative things, and that sets up those conditions too. Um, this is what I think is so fantastic about college. As much as I said a few moments ago that self concept is relatively stable, we can also make the choice to change. So it might be that when you come to college, you find that you actually like studying and you like the material and you like the accountability and ownership and freedom to do things at your own pace. So that covers these four. So even if you want to pause the video right now, what I'd like you to do, we talked a bit about interpersonal in that first chapter, is think about 10 words that describe you. They could be roles, they can be traits. And seriously, if you want to pause it right now, and if you want to write it on a piece of paper, you're going to see in assignments go here. One of the assignments at the end of the week, that's due by Sunday, is to tell me about who you are and how you ended up in this class. So hopefully you're going to find that these slides help a little bit. I'm going to give you a sneak peek of me on the next slide. So feel free to pause right here and fill it in for yourself. So I'll go through, I did it just as I asked you to do it. In terms of me, definitely an educator. Um, I like to think I'm kind. One of the ways that I know it is when people come to me and um, never expecting anything, but they know if they need a soft ear, I'm usually the one that they come to for that. Um, Several years ago, I started following a new nutrition lifestyle. It's called paleo. As a matter of fact, when we get up to informative speeches, you're going to see it in the packet as a model. So I love to cook, and this is the nutrition plan that I follow. Um, Gosh, it's going to be hard to tell if I'm really funny online or not. I know in the classroom I get a whole bunch of laughs, but that might just be because I'm the one who's grading them. But at the end, they feel like they have to. Bad clip art and all. Um, I always wonder, should I put this one up? It doesn't make me look very good. In terms of impatient, I get impatient at silly things. So for instance, if I'm on a line at, say, the grocery store, and then I remember just to take out my phone and answer text, and all of a sudden I don't feel so impatient. Or on my campus, when we're face to face, I might drive all the way around the circle just so I don't have to wait at a red light. Um, Usually with people, I'm quite patient. It's usually the other nuances of life, or sitting in a doctor's office, and then I just bring papers to grade with me, and suddenly I'm the most patient person in the world again. I typically curb the next one in the classroom in terms of sarcasm. With my friends, we usually find that typically pretty funny. It's usually funny when the context is there, not with strangers. I'd be lying if I said I'm always honest. But 99% of the time, absolutely. I think that's one of the greatest things about getting older, too. There's really no reason to lie about much. So, in terms of integrity, this one is pretty high up on my list. And then I think, ugh, should I put this one? It doesn't make me look very good either. In terms of procrastinator, yeah, domestic chores aren't my favorite. I've got laundry that I need to do. I've got a couple dishes in the sink, but I always make sure that I do these things, especially putting the dirty dishes away before the night is over. I'm certainly a hard worker, but again, we're going to come back to these things of the ones that we put down, if they always shine us in the best light or not. The next one's pretty interesting to me. I've been doing CrossFit since December of 2012. Most recently, the CEO has actually stepped down because he's been accused of having some pretty racist tweets, and a lot of CrossFit gyms are now disaffiliating because of it. I don't know if CrossFit is going to be up there the next time I present this lesson. It might be that I'm still doing all that functional fitness, but it might be under another name. I'm definitely a thinker. One of the best compliments I ever got from a student I don't know if he meant it as a compliment, was that it made his head hurt in terms of all the critical thinking that we do in classes. So these are 10 of mine. And if you didn't have a chance to pause this video and do this, I highly encourage you to do it. I think it's going to make an easier time when you write your paper eventually. The textbook goes into all different types of selves. So you could also think about, are the ones that you're hitting on here the ones that you really want to be? Is there anything else on your list that's missing? The next part of the chapter goes into three main influences on self-perception: social and family, culture, gosh, and certainly media. So in terms of social and family influences, this might be a new term, or you might have heard it if you've taken psychology before. The idea between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. What we want is the one that's intrinsic. So for instance, you might be in this class because the extrinsic part is right. You want to get the job that you want to get paid more money because you have the degree. But where the real work comes in is the intrinsic. So it might be that you might want to better yourself because you want to become more self-aware. You might really enjoy the readings and go at a slow rate because you want to make sure that the relationships that you develop are solid and you know the best mechanisms for doing so. When it comes up to your informative speech, you might decide that you want to do way more research than even I'm requiring for the speech because you really enjoy doing it and you want to learn. What research shows is that the intrinsic motivation leads to better results than the extrinsic. So for instance, if you grew up in a house where maybe you got a present every time you came home with a good report card, that would be the extrinsic. And the reason why that one doesn't last as long is because when those rewards stop, right? You probably don't get those kinds of rewards as you got older, and certainly not in college. A lot of times that's when the effort stops. So when we have the intrinsic motivation, that's when it keeps forever. So what is your why? Why do we do it? What research often shows, according to the next one, is that when we praise effort, it's better than praising results. And the reason for that is if children get scared that they're not always going to do well, they might decide not to do something at all. So what the textbook goes into is when kids were trying it with a puzzle. If they knew that they were getting praised every time they did it fast or they did it well, they were afraid to go on to a harder level. Whereas if we praise the effort that someone is trying so hard. Now, that's different than everybody getting a trophy. I'm not a big believer in that one at all. Really interestingly and really scary, part of the textbook goes into abuse. When parents were abusive, one of the things that they found was that they weren't always able to distinguish when their children were making mistakes versus intentional behaviors. So say they knocked a lamp off the end table. They might have attributed to the kid doing something purposely bad when really the kid just wasn't paying attention. So a lot of times, those messages that we hear at home have a phenomenal influence just on the way that we see ourselves and how we feel about ourselves. When we move into part 2 on culture, that's a big one as well. Individualistic versus collectivistic societies means whose goals come first. So for instance, here in the United States, we are very much an individualistic society. Places like Japan is much more collectivistic, where the group goal comes first. Some of the examples they give in the textbook is with social media. So for instance, if you scroll through your feeds on Instagram or things on Twitter or Snapchat, it's funny, the textbook talks a little bit about Facebook. I know students aren't on that as much these days. But in terms of self-enhancement, those are the things that make us sound powerful and wonderful and great, and what a lot of people interpret as bragging. In collectivistic societies, we're not as likely to see that. People are much more humble and unassuming. The textbook goes into more detail about even in the economics of it. So, for instance, in the United States, where very sadly there's huge economic disparity between places, that's where people are more likely to self enhance. When there's more economic equality in places like Japan, it's much, much more modest. The last part of it is media. And one of the things that they spend a good amount of time on the textbook is the culture of lack. So when you think about all the advertisements you see, I don't know what iPhone we're up to these days, but if you don't have the latest one, you're missing out on something, or the video game, or for all the sneakerheads, if it's the latest style. Whereas we don't miss these things if it wasn't because of the media. You know, think about if you and your friends have ever slept outside trying to get the next whatever it might be that the media is saying that we need to have. They certainly do that in terms of anything of pictures. You know, a lot of times people compare themselves to very unrealistic people, whether it's the models and everything that's photoshopped, anything that just makes us feel worse than what we are. That's another thing that I find that students write in their reflection papers at the end of the class, even just when they're paying attention to these things and everything that influences our self-concept. We don't always stop to think that, like, wait a second, that's a little bit off. But the media does that a lot to us, unfortunately. So maybe we'll tweak those things in this class a little bit and think through those things a bit more when we think about it in terms of cognitive complexity, like the last chapter. The next part of the chapter moves into self-presentation. So the idea behind it is obviously the way that we present ourselves. So the textbook talks about pro-social and self-serving. That's why you see the positive for the pro-social, which puts other people forward, and self-serving, which puts ourselves forward, which isn't necessarily a bad thing unless it's putting other people down at the same time. So pro-social might be, say, next week when we're in module 2 and you're working in your groups, you might give credit that other people made you think in ways that you hadn't thought of before. Whereas the self-serving, I doubt I'm going to see it in this class, it might be the idea of, yeah, did you see what I did? I got everybody in the group in line. They didn't do it as well as I did it. But you might think in your work life, you know, maybe people do that who are on your team, or maybe you have one manager who does that. Maybe one is pro-social and gives credit to the whole team, whereas there's another manager who might not do that quite as much. Irving Goffman is a sociologist, and he talked about he coined the term face work. Now, that's not in the textbook, but a lot of times these terms go together, and that's why I decided to include it in today's mini lecture. So face work is the way that we manage these impressions. It could be verbal, it could be nonverbal. You know, think about if you have ever untagged yourself in Facebook. I know that I have. It might have been that it wasn't a great picture of me. I know back in the day I would take comments off my wall if I didn't like it. Those kinds of things have influence. You know, it's the same kind of thing. So right now I'm standing in my apartment. I am dressed as if we were face to face in a classroom. And part of that is me doing face work just as me giving a lecture. I'm much more comfortable in a tank top and shorts. And you might see some old videos on YouTube where I'm testing things out. But typically, in terms of the way we manage impressions, I'll usually be in more dress-up clothes, just like I'm going to ask of you when you do presentations. We'll talk about the guidelines in here, like you're going out to dinner with your grandparents. So in the textbook, again, they talk about Facebook, which I know is pretty outdated. I do like that they talked about Snapchat. I'm not on it, but they go into the terms of that it disappears in 5 seconds, so things aren't lasting. You might have heard in recent news when people actually get rescinded from college offers, based on things that college admissions has found on their Twitter or on their Instagram. So that's a really real thing in terms of managing impressions. And again, it's not that we want to be fake, but in terms of putting our best foot forward. The last part of the chapter goes into high versus low self monitoring. So, a high self monitor is someone who is aware of their surroundings and they adjust to feedback. Someone who's a low self monitor either isn't aware or they don't care, and you could probably see how those people might have problems in life. So, the famous example that I always use is in a grocery store. So, you might be that kid who got the evil eye in the grocery store if you were misbehaving, and you knew just from a look that you better start behaving. Maybe somebody else got tugged on the ear. Anybody have a parent who do that? Sometimes, sadly, kids just get a beat down right in the grocery store. So someone who's a high self-monitor is going to adjust to the feedback around them, but they're probably not going to make the scene. The low self-monitor would. So again, when we relate this to all the different things that we do in class, the high self-monitor is going to be aware when they're on discussion board that other people are around. They're always going to want to be polite. They can certainly put all their opinions in the post. They'll make sure that they could have good grammar. Maybe they're even going to run, the draft of it first before they post. The low self-monitor, like we say, either isn't aware or doesn't care. When we think about it on the spectrum of things, we don't want to be the highest self-monitor because then we're always flipping and we may not be sure of our true selves. Like I said, on the low self-monitor, that can get us in a lot of trouble too. So we want to turn it a little bit higher towards high self-monitor in the way that we can adjust and adapt. So this concludes the part of the mini lecture for chapter 4. People do Top Hat in all different ways. Sometimes they like listening to the mini lectures first and looking at the PowerPoints. Some people just go ahead. I think you should try it either way. And as always, if you have questions, you can put it up in the Q&A in Blackboard. Have a great day, everyone.